More than 60 African and European leaders are attending a major summit on the migration crisis in Europe. The aim is to tackle the economic and security problems that cause people to flee and to persuade African countries to take back more failed asylum seekers. The meeting was planned after a boat sank off Libya in April. Nearly 1,000 people died. Our correspondent Dan Whitehead is at the summit in Malta. Dan, it's being reported that EU leaders are expected to offer countries in Africa billions of euros in exchange for help with the migration crisis. What's the thinking behind this?
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the major headlines which is coming out of the summit so far. In the last few seconds, those 50 plus leaders from Africa and Europe have gathered on the steps of the conference centre for the so-called family photograph. And it is a message of cooperation between the two continents in terms of tackling this migration crisis. And that is centred upon this trust fund which is being signed in the coming 24 hours. A 1.8 billion euro fund set up by Europe, money which is being made available to African countries in return for them tackling the refugee and migrant crisis at root. And that is really one of the pillars of this summit, tackling the issues at root, whether it comes down to political instability, whether it comes down to economic instability. That money being made available for increasing education in countries, including employment opportunities, better jobs, better infrastructure. And that is really the key for Europe to try and stem the flow of the number of migrants which we have seen over the summer from some of these African countries, and in fact entice them to stay in their home countries by increasing the opportunities for them there.
Dan, many of the people that are fleeing due to political reasons and the current political climate in the countries of origin. How is money going to help change the political climate?
Well, a very good question, and who knows whether or not that money, that 1.8 billion euros, is anywhere near enough to change those regimes and those problems in some of the hardest to do countries. In fact, I asked that question to one of the policymakers today. How can money alone solve that problem when you look at countries such as Eritrea and Sudan and Somalia, which have huge governance and political and security issues? And his answer was simply, well, it cannot alone solve those issues. Money is not simply the answer. It's in the finer detail of the declarations which are being signed, and that includes aid and support for those countries to improve the governance and stability for people there. Whether or not this idea will actually work remains to be seen. On paper it sounds good, but of course those huge problems and variations you see in between African countries may not be resolved by 1.8 billion euros alone.
Dan, summits of these nature are often criticised for being high-level talk shops. Are we likely to see any real outcomes achieved and implemented?
Well, yes. I mean, the trust fund is clearly an announcement which will be welcomed by both sides. In previous years, when there have been European-African meetings on migration, many have criticised there not being a dedicated fund. Well, that now is happening. And other areas which they're focusing on is improving legitimate and legal avenues and routes for highly skilled migrants to be able to come to Europe. Of course, many European countries wanting to bolster their labour forces and get some of those highly skilled workers here. They're also introducing more funds, of course, to help on the front line of the Mediterranean Sea here as thousands of migrants continue to make that perilous journey. Many thought that would slow down as the weather entered the winter. That has not been the case. Many people, of course, still fleeing countries including Syria, Eritrea, Nigeria and Afghanistan and Iraq, and that continues. So more money being included for the maritime efforts here, but also focusing on breaking down the business model and the criminal gangs who are behind the people smuggling and human trafficking to make it not worth their while to bring in such huge amounts of money for themselves as they do in this criminal way, which has seen more than 3,000 people lose their lives as they make that perilous journey to Europe.
Correspondent Dan Whitehead coming to us live from Malta, discussing the ongoing migration crisis that's taking place there. EU leaders are expected to offer countries in Africa billions of euros in exchange for help with the crisis.